I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. I want to thank VICA and State Farm for sponsoring this series and for being such gracious collaborators and hosts. The Roundtable and CARE for their support in this project. One of the things that I do want to point out, I always like to start with a disclaimer. What I'm going to talk about are my ideas and my analysis. I don't represent any of these organizations. I'm a professor at Pepperdine as well. These are my points, not the university's. We have lawyers now lurking in every corner of the university, so we have to start with the disclaimers. What we're here to talk about this morning is really a conversation about some of the consequences of the policy choices we've made over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. And what I want to talk about this morning is specifically how the changing energy prices as a result of the state's energy policies is going to affect some key sectors in the LA economy. You have in front of you a rather lengthy report with lots of detail and information. I am not going to deliver that in the next 20 to 25 minutes. What I'm going to try and do is provide some of the highlights and some of the context as we go through it. Because of that, and we're a little compressed on time, I welcome questions, but at some point I may have to cut them off just so we can get done, because I want to be respectful of your time and schedules as well. So, kind of 3 things I want to do quickly this morning. The first thing I want to do is just spend a few minutes talking about what these energy policies look like and how the mechanics of them work. Specifically, what's going on that's driving energy prices higher, and what does that mean? The second is to talk about some narrow parts of the LA economy. I always get critiqued for saying, well, you're only picking these specific cases, but I want to talk about why the particular sectors we're going to talk about are so important, and then talk about what it looks like for them. And then finally move on to a conversation about what does this mean as we look ahead? What are sort of the policy implications of these things? So first, let's talk a little bit about the state's energy policies. There's really 2 major changes over the course of the last 5 years that have redefined how we think about energy prices going into the future. The first is our state's renewable portfolio standard, this idea that we have to have 1/3 of our energy by 2020 coming from renewable sources. Now, why would this have an effect on energy prices? Well, realistically, these are more expensive for the most part. There's a couple small categories that's not the case, than generating electricity through natural gas. And one of the challenges we face in the context of that is that as we push towards those energy sources, energy prices will have to go up. It also means that we'll be buying less cheaper energy. The second part of this is AB 32, which was not only passed in legislation, but was also supported by the voters in a statewide initiative. Voters in LA County, I might point out, supported it 2-to-1. And so, as we talk about some of the implications of this in LA County, understand these are choices that we've made. The basic premise of AB 32 is it says we want to get back to where we were in terms of CO2 emissions, where we were in 1990 by 2020, which is only 5.5 years from now. Now, what does this mean? One of the things, and I fall into this habit because it's so easy to call this pollution. We're not talking about pollutants here. We're talking about carbon dioxide, we're talking about carbon, we're talking about methane, we're talking about emissions that happen naturally when you exhale, right? These are not pollutants. This is about greenhouse gases and the global climate change conversation. That's the commitment we've made as a state to bring these down. This is about a 17% rejection, going from 507 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. That's what that delightful abbreviation stands for. But the point is, this is about a 17% reduction in overall emissions in the next 5.5 years from what they expect it to be in 2020. So if you think about where these things are coming from now, vehicles account for a lot of it. The blue line is where we are now. The red line is where the models expect us to be in 2020. You see a lot of emissions related to passenger vehicles, trucks, other transportation. This is the whole transportation sector here. It's a big sector. You see electric generation. They've broken out in-state and out-of-state import electricity. You stack these up. Obviously, this is the second one. Industrial emissions are the third category. Commercial, relatively small, agriculture, and environmental remedies. So you can see kind of the layout of where these things are coming from. Now, how does this AB 32 market work? One of the key mechanisms, as an economist, we love markets. We love how markets allow us to be more efficient when we do things. And one of the premises of the AB 32 model was that we would go to a cap and trade system. Now, how a cap and trade system works is this. I give you all permission to emit 100 units of carbon dioxide equivalents this year. Next year, I make those 100 units worth only 97. Now you have a choice. You can either reduce how much CO2 you produce in the next year by 3%, or you can, if you manage to reduce by more than 3%, sell those to someone else, or if you don't reduce at all, if you just stay at 100, you can go buy somebody else's permission. So if somebody stopped emitting completely, then they could sell their emissions credits, because they have permission to produce those, to you at a certain price. And so we've created this marketplace. It went into effect in 2013 for energy and industrial producers, for the large sources in those sectors, the large point sources that we were able to track. And it's had some impact on prices, which I'll talk about in just a second. So in this model, there's two important insights. The first is that firms are required to reduce their emissions or to buy these credits. At the same time, the price of those credits, as demand goes up, will go up. And so if I just want to keep emitting at the same level, the idea of AB 32 is that we will reduce emissions by about 3% a year over the next 6 years. That gets us the 18% we need to reach our 2020 goals. And so if I want to produce at the same level, I have to buy more and more of these permissions each year to meet my offset goals. Does that make sense to everybody? So over time, the demand for these things increases, and by the way, they get harder to get, because if you think about it, the guy that you're buying them from only has 97 credits next year as well. So they not only have to reduce their 3%, but they have to do something dramatic enough that they have something to sell. And so it gets harder and harder to do these things. So one point that I really want to emphasize here is this market is designed for prices to go up. One of the ways this market works is that as the price of emitting goes up, and I keep wanting to say polluting, I'm sorry, but as the price of emitting goes up, it becomes more attractive to buy technology to reduce your emissions, because it gets more and more expensive to buy these credits on the market. That's the basic market force. When they talk about market forces in these documents, they're talking about prices going up so that it forces you to buy alternative technologies. And that's an important insight, because the price mechanism is critical to this working. And if we look at it, especially the market went into effect right here, you can see these are going up. Now these have been going up over time. There are other things that affect energy prices besides just the tradable permits and the energy policy. But you can see these prices are going up. You can see for natural gas, a big jump from last year to this year. You see some volatility. Part of this is driven by demand. We had the Great Recession here. And then you kind of see it in this part here. And then it's starting to go back up. Economic activity obviously drives prices up as demand goes up. If we look at electricity prices regionally, we look at the western region of the United States, California, these blue lines for industrial, the red lines for commercial. California is the highest. A few places in the Northeast and Hawaii, which are higher than California, but for the most part, California is one of the highest in the country for utility prices. These are for industrial and residential consumers. Natural gas, Washington's the only state in the western region that's higher than us. You can see the US average here. California is significantly higher. Gasoline prices, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. This has not yet been folded into the AB 32 format. That's the conversation for next year about transportation fuels and how they get folded into the tradable permits market. You can see here California, the price of fuel, this is from a trucking website, is higher than all the western states. This red line here, interestingly enough, is the cost of taxes imposed by the state government in each of these states. Oregon has none. And you can see sort of a correlation with taxes. But even at base prices, California is near the top. It's not the highest, but it is near the top. So given this context, prices are already high and we expect them to go higher. One of the reasons we expect them to go higher is because these allowances shrink in value, they become scarcer, drives the price up. The second thing, and this is one of the interesting artifacts of this, the independent system operator looking at electricity prices estimated in the first 6 months of the cap and trade market, electricity prices went up 15% in California related to the AB 32 enforcement. But if you think about it, as these things go into effect, what are the ones you're going to do first? You're going to do the cheap things. If I have a manufacturing process and there's something that produces a lot of stuff that I can make a small investment in, I do it quickly, right? Over time, as that allowance gets smaller and smaller, I have to do more and more expensive and dramatic things to produce the kind of reductions that I need. So over time, we expect these things to continue to rise in price. The other provision of all this is built into this implementation model is an assumption that there are technologies available, for example, in the electric car industry, where we can sell 1.5 million electric cars. There was just a great article today in the paper about hydrogen cells and the need for hydrogen infrastructure. All of these things are expensive. In many cases, they don't exist yet. For some of the manufacturing processes we're talking about, for some of the biggest emitters, for manufacturing concrete, for example, where they use a lot of electricity, turns out the technologies are not yet available to drive those big grinding stones in a much, much more economic fashion in terms of energy use. So some of these technologies don't exist yet. We expect that they will happen in the future. The models all assume they happen, but they haven't been designed yet. The other point about this cost, transportation fuels are scheduled to be added to the cap and trade system next year. And so we'll start to see increases. Estimates range anywhere from 16 to 76 cents a gallon of increased fuel costs associated with the implementation of the transportation fuels part of this. So that's just a quick overview of the mechanism. Now I want to talk about what this means to the economy. Now, when I talk about the economy, understand rising fuel prices affect households. If you think about the households that are most affected by this, it's going to be those whose, if you look at lower income households, they spend a large share of their income on utilities. Well, we have water issues in California, which will drive water prices up. We have electricity and natural gas provisions, which are designed to raise the price of those energy sources for consumers. Clearly, that's going to have an impact on those households. The second part of this, though, is it affects industries that are highly energy dependent. And unfortunately, in the case of the LA County economy especially, the industries that are most energy dependent happen to be some of those that serve a very important role in this economy. And what that role is it provides opportunity for people who are trying to pursue upward income mobility, that are trying to move from the working poor to the middle class, for example. And it does this, if you think about it, in our economic system, there's two paths to sort of get ahead. Right? You can go to school and you get an education, and we hear lots of conversations about providing quality education opportunities for the next generation, even retraining workers. One of them is education. The second is the professions. There are certain industries where you can enter with a relatively low level of educational attainment and relatively modest skill sets, and you can work your way up in those industries and develop human capital to the point where you're able to attract an income. It allows you to live what we call a middle-class lifestyle. I mean, that's kind of the model of the American dream. If you show up, you work hard, you can work your way up the food chain to the point where you can have a middle-class lifestyle. And so, as we look at the effects of energy, we're going to find that they are concentrated. I like to think of these, I wrote a paper with Joel Cocken called Opportunity, that talked about opportunity urbanism. It's this idea of economies that create opportunity for all levels of the system. So much of economic development is targeted at Silicon Valley type jobs, right? It's the creative class. It's places like Portland that actually don't want people from those messy industries. It's more the Houstons of the world that fit this model. LA has been one of those places for literally decades. It's the kind of place where people would come of all income groups and work hard to advance. And what I want to focus on today is sort of the bottom end of that advancement engine, because these are the sectors that are also, coincidentally, the most energy intensive. So these are sectors where you have a medium wage. If you work hard, you can earn a wage somewhere around $40,000 for one worker. You supplement that with somebody making $20,000 or $30,000. You have just enough money to buy a house and to maybe even live in a place with solid schools and have that kind of middle class dream. And then the second part of it is, it's for industries where there's relatively low entry skill requirements. Now, this is important because these are people who are in the workforce now. LA County has a disproportionate share of low education workers who don't have a lot of educational attainment. We have one of the largest fractions of any urban area of workers with less than a high school degree, but less than a 9th grade degree education, so 8th grade and below. And so it's important that we preserve opportunity for those people in places where they can work and work their way up into these opportunity jobs. So there's 3 sectors where these jobs are concentrated. And I actually had the chart in here with the whole economy, but we don't have time with that. But the bottom line is these are the 3 where those jobs are mostly concentrated. It's not surprising. Manufacturing, trade and transportation. This is the wholesale trade of things, transportation, and construction. Now, as you look at this list, probably occurs to most of us, hey, these are sectors that are under some pressure in our economy, right? And in fact, if we look at manufacturing, this red line is employment. Look what happens to employment over time. This is the aerospace drawdown, 250,000 jobs in the LA County region, which spilled over into a total of 400,000 jobs lost. But you can see something, it didn't stop there. We've been losing these jobs actually since the 70s and 80s. That being said, LA County still has the largest concentration of manufacturing jobs of any MSA in the United States. We have 360,000 jobs or so in this sector. We are still a major manufacturing city. Now, one of the things you'll notice is this wage line keeps going up. The role of this sector in being that opportunity engine is getting more complicated. There are still lots of jobs in this sector, as we'll see in a second, where you can enter with relatively low skills. But one of the things that's happened is the manufacturing that tends to remain in a higher cost place like Los Angeles tends to have more infrastructure, tends to have more machinery. The marginal product of the productivity of the manufacturing sector in LA is kind of off the charts. In fact, I think EDC has a report this morning coming out talking about that very issue. That means, guess what? Lots of machines, lots of equipment, more dependence on energy. And so this is just a quick chart. If I took that $40,000 threshold and I applied it to the manufacturing subsector, all these yellow lines are sectors that meet those standards in some way. Now, one of the things I want to point out is these are salary averages. I understand there's a distribution inside of each of these, but you look at these, there's lots of sectors, production, where you can see opportunity created, especially up here in equipment, fabrication. Computers are more high tech, but food manufacturing, chemical manufacturing, tens of thousands of jobs that fit this opportunity standard. So what happens when you drive up the energy prices? Remember, in that first chart, industrial was one of those big blips. It's the target of this kind of model. What happens? Well, the first thing, not surprising, as the cost goes up, the cost of having a job in this region goes up, eventually you reach that tipping point where you either relocate, or you close, or you invest in yet more technology. Now, I will point out one of the arguments, one of the assumptions of the mapping of the greenhouse gas legislation to their scoping plan that the Air Resources Board did, was that there'll be lots of new green jobs created as a result of these new technologies as we pursue these things. Just a couple observations. One is, I'm always skeptical when people say California is suddenly going to create a bunch of new manufacturing jobs given the long-term trends. But second, at a time when you're driving energy costs up, to the extent these technologies require energy, LA is less attractive. And California actually is less attractive to attracting these kinds of jobs. Even if it were true, think about this. You've been working in an industry for 5 or 10 or 15 years. You've built your human capital in that industry. We suddenly shut that industry down and move you to a new company where you get to start over from scratch. There's a huge disruption in sort of the earnings profile of workers as you make that transition. The fact that you're going to do this in the next 5.5 years is also an issue. Remember, we're talking about the infrastructure of the entire manufacturing structure. We're talking about plants and capital facilities that often take 3 or 4 years to build. Somehow they're going to have to find ways to comply in the next 5.5 years. So, I mean, it's going to be very disruptive. The more likely response is, if I'm going to rebuild anyway, maybe I rebuild somewhere else. The other point I'd like to make is that if these jobs do leave, it's highly unlikely they're going to return. I mean, one of the big trends we see right now in manufacturing is onshoring, where all these firms that ran off to Asia are now pulling jobs back into the United States. One of the things we haven't seen a lot of yet in LA County are firms onshoring to LA County. So especially from a regional perspective, this transition, this pressure on the manufacturing sector becomes problematic. Second one is trade and transportation. Long Beach and LA are still huge ports. You can see the employment here, the red line. See a little bit of drop off from the recession, actually see a little bit of drop off over time. This is actually because I'm looking at LA County. If I were to take all of Southern California together, this line would actually be flatter here and then drop off, because a lot of these jobs went into Kern County, they went into the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino. But there's still a strong presence here. These are operators, these are wholesalers, these are warehousers. I mean, this is a range of jobs. You can look at the report for description of the subsectors. But this is an important sector. This is, again, one of those other sectors where you can come in with relatively low skills. Now, I will point out our ports are under heavy pressure. There's international competition. There's just an article about how Vancouver is shooting the lights out in their trade and transportation, how imports are coming in heavily there. Ensenada's making a concerted effort to compete with LA now that the border is easier to get across with trucks. The Panama Canal, the widening is just about to come into place. There's now a conversation about a new canal in Nicaragua. What that does is it says, if I have a ship coming from China and I have products that are going to the Midwest or the Northeast, instead of dropping them in LA and shipping them across the country, I can take them to New Orleans or Houston, or I can take them to Tampa, or I can take them to Charleston, one of the eastern ports, Savannah, and I can actually take it there, and it's actually cheaper to leave it on the ship and drive the ship around than to move it across land. And so there's going to be increased competition there. The other issue, and this is going to unfold next year, are the transportation fuels component. One of the things we do know about next year is that if we increase the price of fuel 76 cents a gallon, it's going to change the math for these transportation companies in terms of how they move resources. There's likely to be a bit more rail, which is less labor intensive, and a bit less trucking, which is the kind of sectors that have a lot of those opportunities. The other thing that's happening simultaneously is there's a lot of pressures on the ports, because they are targeted point sources in the greenhouse gas process, to increase the number of compressed natural gas and electric vehicles being used in those ports. Two processes, by the way, which we are also working really hard to raise the prices of in terms of the fuels. Finally, construction. This is the hardest one. There was just Janet Yellen was just in Congress this morning testifying the housing market is in the doldrums. Right? And if we look at construction, we can see here the drawdown. We can see the 400,000 jobs lost in LA. Real estate prices drop dramatically. Employment in construction collapses, builds up. Interestingly enough, declines a bit during the housing bubble inside of LA County, because a lot of the development moved outside of LA. Right? And we see a little bit of a recovery here. Obviously, these are the trades. Interesting thing about it, we actually have a real opportunity in this sector to create a portal for lots of new workers to join that track, because a lot of these guys left the sector for good. I have a good friend who had a concrete pumping truck. He now drives buses for the city of Simi Valley, and he loves it. And he's not going to go back to the uncertainty of the busing, of the concrete industry, when he can have that guaranteed income for his household. And so there's a lot of openings here as this sector starts to recover. We've seen some signs of life of recovery. One of the challenges you have is, especially in the industrial real estate market, part of what we're looking for is driven by what's happening in manufacturing. In order for there to be demand for industrial space, there has to be industry to demand it. And so as we see a suppressing effect on manufacturing, we might see some fall off in industrial real estate development. The other part, and I mentioned this before, concrete is one of the most energy intensive products to make in the world. You have to grind stuff up really fine. And it takes a lot of energy to drive those big grinders. Well, if I increase the price of electricity by, say, 25%, what's that do to the cost of concrete? Well, it's going to drive it up by at least 15 or 20%. As construction materials get more expensive, it makes it harder to plan developments. The second part is, and if you think about this, I'm building a building over there. I'm not building a building next to the plant. I'm building a building over there. All the materials, everything I need to build that building, and by the way, all the stuff I need to take away to build the building as well, all have to be transported. As I increase transportation fuel prices, it increases the price of building the projects as well. So if we think about it, there's sort of these three sectors where you have, which have been a pipeline for opportunity for people migrating from the working poor to the middle class. All of them they're actually the three sectors, with the exception of maybe server farms on the IT side of this equation, where you have thousands of computers in giant air-conditioned buildings. these are some of the sectors that are going to be most impacted by energy policy. So the question then is, what does this mean looking forward? It's really about balance. It's about finding a way to balance our economic opportunity, preserving this pipeline, with our environmental goals. AB 32, the Renewable Portfolio Standards both set very aggressive and bold goals to try and reduce the carbon footprint of the state of California. The question is, at what price? And there's sort of 4 categories that I want to talk about. The first has to do with the timing of this process. The second has to do with how we target these. The third has to do with finding ways to collaborate. And the fourth is, I call it sharing here. That's the nice way of saying accountability, transparency. It's this idea of making sure people understand what the implications of the choices are as we move ahead. So first, let me just start off by pointing out there's this assumption in the back of all of our minds, we're doing all this, we must be a really nasty state when it comes to our carbon footprint. If you look at carbon footprint, energy consumption per capita, you will find California is second, I think is 4th cleanest across the country. New York is the cleanest. We have one of the lowest per capita energy consumption rates in the country. It's kind of like water policy where we always assume Southern California are the ones drinking all the water. Northern California uses a lot more water per person than we do. And so as you look at this, understand we're starting from a relatively low intensity use to begin with. The other thing to think about is the world we live in is becoming more energy intensive. How many plugs do you plug into your house every night to charge your phones, your laptops, your tablets, and everything else? So timing is critical. I think it's important for us to take a step back as we look at this. So much of the focus in AB 32 so far has been regulatory. We have a deadline, we have a statutory deadline, we have all these steps in the middle. How do we get there? Now I think it's an important time for us to take a step back and remember, this is aspirational. The world does not end on January 1st, 2021 if we don't reach our 1990 levels. I think that's an important point for us to remember. There are times when you have policy implementations like this where that is the case. This is not one of those times. The second is we have a struggling economy. I mean, you heard it in the Federal Reserve conversation this morning. You see it in all the studies and the conversations about the economy. The only sectors that are going nuts right now seem to be IT in the Bay Area. And about half of that is IPO driven. It's financial markets driven. Our financial markets have gone crazy. And I say that literally. They are crazy. There is no rationality in them at this point. But there are more IPOs in the first quarter of this year in the Bay Area than there have been since even the dot-com bubble days. There is a financial market effect going on here. Otherwise, the economy generally is struggling across the board. So we're stacking these effects on top of at least a tentative economy. The other part is most of the models don't build into a recession in the next 6 years. When they look at the impacts of all these policy choices, there's not really a slowdown or a recession. Now, there's not fast growth in any of the models either. But the point being that at least I realistically expect some sort of economic setback in the next 5 to 7 years. The other point I want to make in terms of timing is that as we move ahead in this, we need to balance attaining those goals against the very real fact that while missing it by 1 or 2% in the next 4 or 5 years is not necessarily going to be, it's not going to be detrimental to the future of the state. If we manage to strip away this opportunity pipeline from our economy, that will have very long-term implications, and it will trap even more workers on the wrong side of the safety net, where they're forced to stay in the safety net because there's no pathway for them out of it. So I think that we have to be careful in terms of the timing of this, that we don't get so focused on 2020 as a number and 2050 as a number that we lose track of what we're trading off. The second thing is, to the extent that we are moving ahead, we need to target these sectors. These opportunity sectors are absolutely essential to maintaining our economy. And it goes far beyond the goods that are produced. There's a ripple to the entire economy. We're not just talking about preserving the middle class, we're talking about the real estate market. Because who buys the homes, besides the Chinese, are the people who are moving up into the middle class. That's where your new demand comes for housing, for example. The state should use all the tools available to try and protect jobs, especially in these sectors. And I'm an economist, so I don't normally make this argument, but this is such an important part of our economy. There are offsets, there are credits you get for doing good things like planting trees and promoting things like that. To the extent we can, we may want to think about delaying implementation. AB 32 actually had in its design the concept that in a bad economy, the governor could set it aside for a year. So it's not that these were unanticipated. It's things we might want to think about. We might want to think about tax credits for these industries in terms of preserving employment. You say you keep people employed, we'll give you credit, we'll give you exemptions, we'll give you allowances, whatever it is to allow you to offset this. And we may want to create some special allocations for these firms where maybe that 3% decline becomes a 1% or something like that to protect some of these key industries as we move ahead. Collaboration. One of the challenges is the Air Resources Board was given a huge job. Figure out what our emissions are, figure out what they should be, and then build this market, by the way, in the next 18 months. There's been a huge focus on compliance and regulation. Now we need to have that conversation. Okay, how do we tweak this to make it feasible? Maybe we don't need to have electric cars. Maybe we can just persuade, instead of 1.5 million electric cars, which tend to be very expensive, maybe we can get 3 million people to convert to compressed natural gas, which has a much lower footprint than gasoline and only costs a couple $1,000 or $3,000 to refit a car. I mean, there are other options and approaches that haven't been part of this conversation yet that need to be seriously introduced in the conversation. Maybe we don't get 100%, maybe we don't get a zero emissions building or a zero emissions car. Maybe we get one that produces 90% less. There are natural gas generation technologies that are very clean as well in terms of carbon footprint. Regulators should be open to these alternative approaches. And then, I mean, this sounds kind of silly, but if one of the things is that your energy prices are high, do everything you can to get lower energy prices. That may mean tapping other reserves and sources. It may mean slowing down on the renewable portfolio standard. It may say, well, let's get cleaner, but we don't have to push these things as fast because that's driving up costs too quickly. I'm not saying that any of these are the right answer. My point is there needs to be a lot more collaboration with the generators, with the electricity industry, with the manufacturing industry, to find that balance, to find what's going to work to accomplish as much as we can in the way that's least disruptive to these economic sectors. And then finally, in the day of technology, there's no reason why this doesn't exist. We need to have real-time information. There are a lot of assumptions in all of these business models and all the models for the environment and the economy about what's going to happen. We should have all that data published, all the details of that, and then there should be a dashboard right next to it that shows where we are relative to it. Did we lose more manufacturing jobs than we thought or fewer? Did we lose more transportation jobs or fewer? Did we get all these green jobs that the model assumes we have? What are our emissions? What's the price of electricity today? Is it higher than we thought it would be or lower? All that stuff needs to be happening real time. And it must be accessible. There's a lot of data out there, believe me, I looked at a lot of it for this paper. We need to have information that the public can understand. It needs to be put into dashboards and templates that people can follow. This tracking of the assumptions is really important. I would actually argue instead of having the Air Resources Board exclusively in charge of this process, there actually needs to be more of a collaborative process where the governing board includes more participants from the private sector, includes more participants from these stakeholder groups, especially from the communities that are most likely to lose the jobs. I think one of the big challenges that we have going forward is not, do we want to try and accomplish this? Absolutely we do. The question is, what's the best way to balance off the cost of accomplishing it very quickly in a very rigid fashion versus finding opportunities to create flexibility and maybe to delay some pieces of it so that we preserve the important parts of our economy that we've worked so hard to hold on to over these past decades. So with that, actually I think pretty close on time even. I'm a college professor, so time sort of stops when I start talking. So I welcome any questions.
So, if I could, can I add a point and then continue to go right to questions? Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Rob Lapsley. I'm with the California Business Roundtable. We're down here this morning to express our appreciation for you coming together here to be able to talk about what is really one of the most vital issues facing California's business community, but also California's citizens. As all of you have to go home and live with, obviously, your utility bills, this hits us at every level in every single thing that we do. And so what we wanted to do from a roundtable perspective is look at and bring information to the leaders in the communities, all of you, to be able to show what is happening in real time and where are we going now that we are implementing these policies, so that we as advocates, as leaders in the business community, can bring better information to the policymakers in what's getting ready for the next round of policy making starting in January. I'm just touching that very quickly. So the bottom line is we are gravely concerned about California's energy future in terms of its planning and the impact of its policies. We created an effort with statewide business groups at all levels called Californians for Affordable and Reliable Energy. It's one of the partners here today with you. And again, Stuart, thank you for your partnership, your leadership in doing this. But we have brought the resources of everyone together to be able to look at, well, what do we do? What can we bring to the table to help from a policy perspective? And there's two pieces currently in front of you that are happening in Sacramento to try and help with the outstanding recommendations. Because every single thing that Dr. Shires talked about today is absolutely right on, and some of them haven't even been brought to the table yet. But Assemblyman Henry Perea out of Fresno has two bills. One, AB 1763, to create a statewide comprehensive energy plan. There's 39 states in this country that have one. California is not one of them. We have, through the Energy Commission, called the IPER, Integrated Energy Plan, which looks at different pieces of California's energy process, but not a comprehensive energy plan that most importantly brings the economics of energy on the business community into planning and execution of what's happening on state policy. There's no cost benefit going on up there whatsoever. I don't care what they say, it's not happening. Second piece, AB 69. Dr. Shires mentioned we are about to see a 15 to 50 cent price increase at a minimum of what's going to happen when fuels go under the cap, the emissions cap, starting January 1st of 2015. So get ready, everybody, because if you need vehicles for your businesses or just at home, get ready. Think price of gas is bad now? Wait till you see what's coming. And there's no way around this unless you bring balance to the implementation of what's happening with AB 32. We support AB 32. Our coalition does, the roundtable does. We have to achieve our climate goals, but it's how you achieve it and how you do it in the implementation through the balance of these policies. When you look at the cost benefit of these, of the actual real life impacts, businesses, consumers, disadvantaged communities, they all matter. So how you do it is critical. Everybody remember energy deregulation from the 90s? How'd that work out? Why? Because it's how you did it. Were you tracking the information like Dr. Shires said through the dashboards? Were you looking at how these pieces came together? So this all matters. And that's what we wanted to bring to you today, because we need your help. We gotta all stick together. We've done that. Today was critical, so again, thank you for this opportunity. But we wanted to see exactly, again, the information for LA policymakers, because it helps them. This piece does that. It's an outstanding piece, and it fits exactly into what we're doing overall in helping to bring this to the governor. Now let me say this in closing, I'll get out of the way to get to the real questions. January of 2015, not only does fuels under the cap kick in, January of 2015, you are about to see the governor unroll California's new energy policy. Anybody know what that is?
No.
Neither does anybody else. It's cooked, it's in the governor's office, and they're sitting on it until January. It's going to go out, it's going to be unveiled, and then it's going to go into legislation. It's going to be a paradigm shift from what we're hearing in terms of how they're constructing all the different pieces, but no one yet knows exactly how it's going to come together. So while we are talking today about the two bills, AB 69 and AB 1763. The most important thing is, by us coming together, we have to be prepared to weigh in what's going to be coming next January. Because that's when it's going to matter even more, because that sets the stage for what's coming in 2030 and what's coming in 2050. And as Dr. Shire said, a lot of the technologies that are going to need to achieve some of the goals that we believe are coming don't even exist yet. So then what do you do? So these are the things that are critical for the business community to talk about, to educate our policymakers, and to get ready to say you have to do your jobs both in the implementation and also the oversight of what's happening with the agencies between the Energy Commission, the Air Board, the PUC, and Cal ISO, who all are taking obviously a role in driving this forward. So thank you for this opportunity to be here, and if we can ever be of help on any of these issues, that's what we're here for. But Dr. Shires, thank you for what we think is just one of the best reports that we've seen on this issue.
It's my pleasure.
One of the things that wasn't on the charts was the cost of food. In this region, I suspect it may be more noticeable. Foodstuffs are being forced to be grown at greater distances, and then getting them down into the area of consumption costs more because of the cost of energy. I suppose at some household income level, there is an indifference to the migration of prices going up, but the people at the really low end of the spectrum are the guys that this is going to be fairly burdensome for, and it already has been. I mean, when you look at the prices of food on the shelves, is there any awareness in the policy setting arena of the need to bring some moderation to energy prices so that the impact on the food consumed can be mitigated a bit?
Well, Janet Yellen this morning said inflation's coming. You know, I consider myself pretty middle income, and I have to say food prices, I mean, $10 for a pound of meat. Inflation is here, especially in the foodstuff sector. A half gallon of ice cream is now a quart and a half. It used to be 2 quarts, now it's a quart and a half, but it's the same price or more. It's already there. I think one of the things, like I said, I focused on these 3 sectors. There are other sectors like the hospitality sector, for example, hotels, where energy costs are one of their important costs. Go back to the 1970s, go to the Great Recession. One of the complicators of the Great Recession was fuel prices. Right, when that gas hit $5 a gallon, 2 things happened. It was interesting. One is people used a lot less, but 2, it accelerated the recession. Now the recession was happening anyway, but if you go back to the 1970s, it was all oil prices, right? The 2 OPEC oil shocks. We know energy prices have a big impact on the economy. Inflation in the energy sector is going to ripple across the whole economy. I said I focused on these 3 sectors because I think they're so critical to the infrastructure of what our capitalistic system is supposed to do. But the reality is it will have effects across the economy, and it will accelerate inflation, which is either a good thing if you have lots of debt, or a bad thing if you're trying to buy a home or finance an education or something like that.
Can I add something to that? The answer is no. Unequivocally, no. There is one major disconnect, and that is the reality of what's going on the ground with where they want to drive these policies for climate change. California doesn't have an energy policy, but we sure as hell have a climate change policy. That's the bottom line. So what's driving the economy? Climate change, and not an energy policy. So that is what we're trying to show them and try and educate them that you can't have one without the other, because obviously there's going to be unintended consequences with your climate change policies. Nothing is perfect. Again, we support the goals, we support the overall policy, but there are unintended consequences. So you have got to have that. And then you factor in, and again, it goes back to those dashboards. We had to put together an organization called the California Center for Jobs and the Economy, where we've been able to take all the economic data in the state, break it down to the legislative level. And it's the centerforjobs.org. But we put those dashboards in for all the Assembly and Senate districts. You can all go online, pull it down, to be able to articulate exactly that, even down to the cost of food, because of the criticality of that.
You commented earlier that you support 32. Maybe 32 is one of the drivers of the fuel price issue that is affecting the movement of commerce across America, including foodstuffs and things of that sort. It strikes me that we're like people with loaded weapons in our hands and the thing's pointed at our foot. And we're so anxious to have 32 that we're squeezing the trigger on the availability of certain commodities that are critical to our lives.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I took as a given in the course of this paper is the voters have ruled on 32 for the short term.
Yes.
I mean, I think there's a broader question of, as we start to count the cost, are there things we want to tweak about it?
Yes.
But I think on the face of it, I just took that as a given for the analysis. I mean, I think it's difficult at this point without having some information to be able to go back and say what needs to be tweaked.
And the voters weighed in on Prop 23, that was clear. So it is the law of the land, and that is not going to change. So now it's all about, again, that implementation piece, and hopefully the gun doesn't get pointed at our head, it's only pointed at our foot. That's why, again, the leadership in this room, everything matters, particularly right now. And then, because it has to get ready for the next round. We have AB 32 now, but what happens when you look at the RPS standards for 33%? You know, there's folks, there's been bills that want to jump it to 50 and 60%. Oh my, you think cost energy is going high now? If they had driven it to 50% and we had not killed that off in Sacramento, again, it would be astronomical, and we would be totally and completely uncompetitive versus jobs in the other states, as opposed to just mainly uncompetitive. So those are the things, the real life pieces that we're trying to deal with. Again, why we appreciate everyone here being in this room.
It's important that you should talk about the politics of some of the Democrats who are concerned about the June 2015 date, the limit they set.
So part of the effort in what we're trying to do, again, overall, is that we've tried to be very clear that California obviously has a very uneven economic recovery, and we have a two-tier economy going on. You go up and down the coast, the economy remains strong. You go to San Francisco, the place is on fire. Silicon Valley's helping to drive the economy. But then you go, obviously, 60 miles inland, up and down the state, and things look completely different. So we've been trying to, again, be very clear with the Center for Jobs and with all of our efforts to the policymakers of exactly where all this is. And we've been able, in all of our efforts, to develop a very strong group internally in the Assembly with what we call a more pro-business Democrat coalition, who absolutely get this, because a lot of them are in these inland districts, particularly up and down the valley. So I mentioned Assemblyman Henry Correa just a moment ago from Fresno. Obviously his district's ground zero practically for unemployment, for the energy price increases. I mean, everywhere you turn, his district is in the middle of all this. So he has helped lead an effort, not just on those two bills, but they put together a letter that they sent to the governor that outlined these exact concerns that Dr. Shires has presented today. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? What we need to do? And then they advocated very strongly and asked them specifically to not rush into the January 1st date for fuels under the cap, but to be able to take a step back and look at the implementation timelines and then use their next proposal on the new policy to maybe rework how some of these things go and blend it into the new proposals, so that we're not going to face another immediate fuels increase, both in diesel and gasoline, which we obviously can't afford an impact on our economy. So he's been an outstanding leader with this, will continue to be, and again is put in a bright focus with this. And there's other members up and down. Brendan is dealing with them up, every day with Hannah Jackson and Pavley and everybody else, who have the coastal districts who only want to talk about the benefits of these policies. They are unwilling to consider the real life economic impacts of the unintended consequences. Period. And obviously the environmental groups are driving that as well. So we have to bring balance.
So,
Thanks, Jared. In the chart, carbon emissions by source,
What page is that?
this is page 6 of the handout. Anyway, it's a really useful chart. I was wondering if you also examined natural carbon emissions from geothermal, as well as for example, peat moss in the Sacramento Delta, which is a huge carbon emitter. How much do those contribute to overall emissions, do we know?
I don't actually, in the survey, I know they had a section that talked about it, but I don't recall any numbers. These are the sort of man-made
Yeah.
portions of it. I know there is some, they look at it to some extent. I don't recall total estimates of what those are.
Okay. According to, some of us have done the Delta tour with Metropolitan Water District. And I've done it twice. And there's one thing, Kurt, do you remember Kurt's last name? The scientist, anyway. He says the biggest contributor to California's CO2 emissions is the peat moss that is so prevalent in the Sacramento Delta. And I was so intrigued by it, 2 years later when I went on the same trip, I asked him again, he repeated the same thing. But I haven't seen that in other studies, that he's just my only source.
I think the focus of AB 32 is kind of on the human interaction
Yeah.
with emissions.
Although the water bond would address that aspect of it
It could.
for habitat restoration.
We could just flood it.
We don't
Right.
need water.
Yeah, I was just saying, we can flood it with our rather extensive water supply.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that either. That's interesting. There's never been, as actually I said, it's been human interaction, but never heard that brought into it. You know, lots of cows brought into
Yeah.
it, but not the peat moss.
Yes. Well, and volcanoes, right?
So,
But I mean, the focus of the AB 32, the climate change argument, is clearly on human interaction, right? The whole argument behind the hockey stick is that human interaction is accelerating that. I mean, the last ice age was 25,000 years ago, so technically we've had global warming for 25,000 years. But the argument is about that acceleration over the last decade, right? Or over the last 50 years especially. I hadn't thought of that before.
I want to ask, actually speaking of water, one of the bigger energy uses in the state is actual water conveyance itself. Did you, in your research, did you find anything of what AB 32 does with the conveyance of water as well, and what that would do, what that could do with the cost?
I haven't, only because I suspect the whole water debate is going, the price of water obviously is about to start behaving in less historic ways, right? We're about to see some irrationality in water price. We've already seen some irrationality, but I think it's going to accelerate. So I mean, I think one of the questions is, to what extent does energy cost contribute to the price of water? I suspect in the long term, on average, it's a significant factor and it would affect the cost of that resource. But I think what we're about to see in the market, and what we've seen in the last 6 months especially, there's going to be such, it's going back to 2001 and electricity, right? There's going to be these huge gyrations in energy prices, and I think electricity will be less important in the short run. I think in the long run, you're absolutely right. The pumps that dry that stuff up, the lift to get it over to Tehachapi and all those kinds of things add to costs.
And the state water contractors are very concerned about the role of rising energy costs and what that means for the future and of their members. And that's a group that we're working with the CARE Coalition as well. And we're doing an event specifically next month to talk about water and the nexus there with rising energy costs. That's something that resonates very strongly with that group, and they're clearly concerned, as Rob mentioned, with what's going to happen as far as the post-2020 goals as well, so the 2030, 2050 plans for California, and how do we try to create a more coordinated approach, because right now water policies and energy policies are happening in silos, and there needs to be more integration.
Any other questions?
I have a question. On page 21, you, in the second driving up the cost of energy will, result in people buying less energy, and I know that that's kind of the intent with the cap on fuels is they kind of want gas to be expensive enough that people stop driving. But then you also say that the extra disposable income they represent are key to the predicted increases in economic activity needed to offset the higher costs, and you say this argument seems self-contradictory. Can you kind of explain that?
I don't actually have a copy of it. Where's it at?
Page 21, the second paragraph.
Oh, well, the idea that if you're not buying as much, and it is in fact internally self-contradictory.
Yeah.
But one of the arguments that's been laid out there is that if I'm buying less energy, if I'm buying less gas and I have more efficient appliances in my household, I now have more money to spend. Even though it costs more.
Yeah.
And that's right, and that's part of why I raised that point is, it is self-contradictory in some ways. I'm paying a lot more for this good, and in fact, the reason why I'm buying less of it is because it's too expensive. But the argument goes that I would have spent that money anyway if the price hadn't been higher. I would have spent 80% of it, say, if the price went up 20%. And so I now have that 80% of income.
Is history an indicator of that? If it's like I spend 100 on energy a month and I'm still spending that much, I just have a lot less of it. It looks like I decreased my usage, which I did, but is there any indicator that there will be extra money?
Well, we know during the Great Recession that the gasoline use, for example, when the price of gas went over $5 a gallon, it went down 10 to 15% in use. What we don't know is how much of that use was because it was $5 a gallon and how much of it was because I didn't have to drive to work because I lost my job.
Yeah.
Right, and we don't know the details of how those things break out. But there was, and in fact, during the AB 32 political debates, when Proposition 23 was on the ballot, there was this great paper done to support AB 32 that basically said, understand, because we're forcing people to buy less power, when there's a price spike in electricity, we've saved them from that. Right, it's because you're doing less and you have less opportunity, we've protected you from the risks associated with being dependent on those things. I mean, there's this sort of internal inconsistency in that part of the argument. It is part of the economic models, the competitive general equilibrium models that they use to estimate the effects. I actually don't think those things matter a lot in the grand scheme of things because I think they'll wash out. We will spend as much on energy as we can afford as we need to. I don't think it's going to be zero. But it's not going to be 100% of our income either that we change. But what is going to matter more is what I get for it and what my quality of life is as a result of that. And I do think that's going to go down. If nothing else, it's going to drive inflation.
Any more questions? All right, well, let's thank Dr. Shires.